Yesterday was so much fun. I had a good time with that. Just enjoyed each night, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night, going through the different Gospels of Luke and John and Matthew. And Elliot asked me today, he says, "What's today's lesson about?" And I said, "We're going to study Mark." So we're going to hit the Gospel of Mark during the worship hour. And so I'm going to do that. I want to reiterate how appreciative I am of the opportunity to do this. It's just been such a blessing for me to get to know you and get to be a part of this congregation. I had a little longer here. Most of the workshops I do start on Friday night, go Saturday, and then I preach on Sunday, and then I leave. But I got extra time here, and so it's just kind of made it even more family to me. And so I really appreciate that. I enjoyed last night, dinner with y'all, and getting to just visit and talk about some things. In fact, some stuff we're going to be talking about during Bible class hour. But let's start with a prayer, and then we'll dig into some stuff on how can we grow the church. Father, we are so thankful for another day, just a day that we can breathe air into our lungs and to just spend this time to reflect on who you are and to honor you in the time that we're together. And Father, I thank you for the church here at Albert Lee and just for the great privilege it's been to be here this week and to share in the lessons and to share in the weekend and to be able to meet brethren from all over yesterday and to get to share things from your word and to provide some instruction that hopefully will be beneficial and encouraging to those who are part of it. As we meet today and as we think about how can we grow your church, we ask that you would help us to not only understand the value and the benefit of those things that we need to do. We pray that you would grant us the wisdom that we need to see the opportunities that exist and that we would be able to help others come to know Jesus. We can help them be a part of your family and that the kingdom here will grow in ways that will be exciting and that will help this congregation really become who you want them to be. Bless our time together and pray that our day will honor you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I have been asked a lot of different times over the years about how do you grow the church. And I've had a lot of different answers that I've given to that over the years. How do you grow the church? And so I think a lot of times we kind of have to define what do we mean by grow. What does it mean to grow the church? Are we talking about growing the church spiritually, that we're becoming more mature in the faith? Or are we talking about growing numerically? We're talking about having more people that are converted and that come to know Jesus. And maybe it's both when we use that phrase. We know we really want to grow as the church. But I want to spend the time that we have this morning during this hour to talk about how we grow the church. And primarily, I want to just start by asking you, what do you think are some things that need to happen in order for the church to grow here at Albert Lee? Because I don't know the culture of the community well. I'm getting to know each of you a little bit better. But I think it would be important that because you live here, because you know this area, what do you think is needed in order to help this congregation grow? And I have a marker ready to mark. Prayer. Prayer. Seems logical, doesn't it? That we would probably start with the foundation of asking God to kind of help us with that. So prayer, like that.
Proactive.
Be proactive.
It's not going to grow on its own. Real slow it does.
You know, I really like that. And we've started a P theme. So, but I do like that. I like the being proactive because it's not going to happen by accident. And it's not going to happen simply because you have a building here. I mean, you need a place where you're going to come together, but the thing is simply because you have a building or you have a place that you're going to meet doesn't mean that people are going to come. And I had an elder tell me that one time. I was asking him about how do we grow the congregation here. And he said, we built this facility, and if they want to know the truth, they can come. And I'm like, I don't read that in Scripture. That's not the way that works. We do have to be proactive. Now, give me some ways. Let's talk about that for just a second. What are some ways that we can be proactive? All right, so we're talking about outreach. And do you have some ways, what are some ideas about outreach? What kind of things?
Well, we had a clothing thing.
Okay. Could be clothing.
And we did,
Repair clothes.
Oh, you know, we talked about that last night.
Everybody wants to be.
I don't think. But the question I asked is, what do you do in the winter? You don't give away root beer floats. But the thing we talked about last night was the possibility of doing like hot chocolate or coffee. You know, what if you did a thing where you did that, where you offered hot chocolate or offered coffee? You know, there are a lot of people that be coming by, it's like it's cold, and they want something warm to drink. So you got coffee, you got hot chocolate. Might not want the kind of coffee that Rick makes, but I don't drink coffee, so I couldn't tell you. I just heard you talking.
It was a little stout yesterday.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
But anyway, what other kinds of outreach could you do?
We had, years ago, we had events.
What kind of events?
Marriage enrichment.
Oh, okay.
That was one that I remember.
So you can do a marriage enrichment. What are some other kinds of things that people you think might need or that they might be interested in this community?
something for the younger kids.
All right.
What it is, I don't know.
Well,
This is the youth, and get the youth to come.
what were we talking about this morning?
Yep.
You know, we were talking this morning, last night I was picking on Jason a little bit, and I said, you know what you ought to do is you ought to just set up a little shop out here and teach people how to change the oil. Teach them how to work on your car. I mean, there are all kinds of things you can do like that. But Rick and I were talking this morning, I said, what? Because I knew he had done some kind of teaching at one of the colleges on some leadership stuff. I said, what if you offered a class to the local community college, to the high school, or even some of the surrounding communities, and said, look, what we're going to do is we're offering for free a 3-hour seminar on some specific things about leadership, or how to start your own business, how to be an entrepreneur, you know, just helping people understand how they can take on some leadership stuff in the school or on their jobs. I would think some of the businesses around here would be interested in some of their employees learning some leadership skills. And you could offer a seminar, a 2-hour or a 3-hour, whatever you want to do, whatever you might want to develop in that. And if that grows and you start getting more and more of that kind of stuff happening, we could schedule to bring up several guys from Sunset that could do some different areas about leadership.
Professional.
Huh?
Professional.
No. But areas that we do on a regular basis that might not be what you do. But I mean, it's doable. You know, you can do those kinds of things. But the main thing is you want people, you want visibility to the building. You want people to come here.
Yep.
Because if they come here and they know that there's stuff going on here, then at some point they're going to be like, you know, maybe we should go check them out someday. And when they come, then you love on them and you take them to lunch and or you have a potluck or, you know, whatever it is, but spend time getting to know them. So I like that. Some kind of events. Any other kind of events you can think of?
Go ahead.
Something like financial peace.
Okay.
Or financial budgeting, planning, things like that.
We also talked about we were looking at our individual assets that we have right here in the building. Jason with his, like you already mentioned, Charity doing a smoking cessation class or a diabetes class or something along that line, just things that would be of benefit.
Oh, Linda doing crocheting or sewing or something, yeah.
There's a lot of old people in this area, they'll like that, because they're not going somewhere real far. The younger kids ain't, but the older people would.
We're not doing scrapbooking.
Why not?
I'm kidding. My sister would want to come up here and ask why.
Having a movie night.
Oh, You have a movie night, yeah.
Yeah. A Christian Bible movie night, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and that was the other thing I said, because you never really know what people would be interested in or what they might need until you start asking around and kind of telling people, you know, what are some of the types of things. There used to be an organization, and I don't know what happened to them, but we used them for several years. They were an organization, and they were doing this geofencing kind of thing, but what they did was they would take, like, the address of a church building, and they would do like a 3-mile radius or a 5-mile radius, whichever you wanted, and they would be able to break down for you everything about the demographics of that area. The thing I loved about, they had all kinds of information about the ages of people and the income of people and the racial breakdown of people. They had all that ethnic stuff. But the thing they did that I loved the most is they had a section in there that talked about the needs of people. What were the types of things that people were expressing that they were concerned about? Sometimes there were issues with games, there was taking care of elderly parents, there were issues of school and education. I mean, there were all kinds of things that they would list out there. Some were financial, you know, how do we retire? I can't remember all of them. But that was the section that when I would work with the congregation, I'd go in and say, look, here are the needs that the community around you is expressing that they have. What if you then started developing the types of events that you could offer to the community to address those needs? Now, not everybody in the community had the same needs, but if you started doing a variety of types of events, then you could offer those kinds of things to help people. Because everybody has what a friend of mine calls pain points. There are certain things that are going on in our lives that we really wish we could find someone that could help us with those things. And shouldn't the church offer that? I mean, shouldn't the church provide some training in those kinds of things like this, whether it's financial or leadership or marriage, or maybe it's diabetes or smoking or sewing or moving, that, whatever it is, if people in the community begin to recognize, wait a minute, this congregation here is providing some things that are helping people, that might bring some folks around and say, what else do you have that you're doing? Then you get an opportunity to teach them. You know, when we lived in Greenbrier, one of my favorite things was that we had the reputation in that community of being the congregation that if you wanted help, they would help. I thought that was a pretty cool reputation. And it was all because we had one woman in that congregation that had a love for taking care of people who had legitimate needs. And so she set up, once a year we did a food and clothing drive, and she went to the school system and met with the counselor, and she found out the kids in that school that had legitimate needs of food and clothing. And she contacted those families, and she had a form that she would tell them, if you will fill this out, if you'll come on this day, we're going to have everything set up in the building for you. It looked like Walmart. I mean, we had a T-shaped building, and on the left-hand wing, we had women's, and on the right-hand wing, we had the men's, and those people that came could go through and get however much they wanted. And it was one of the few times in the history of that congregation we had almost 100% involvement from everybody in the congregation. Because everybody either was involved in bringing stuff, or they were involved in sorting and folding and organizing. And I'm telling you, this woman, she was on it. And we started out the first year, I think we helped maybe about 25 families, but by the time it was over, we were helping close to 100 families every year. I had businesses in town that were donating stuff to help. We had other churches, I mean denominational people, that were bringing stuff for us to help give to people in the community. And we had those denominations that when people would come to them, they'd say, if you want help, you need to go to the Church of Christ. Those people will help you. That was our reputation. I thought, isn't that who we should be? Shouldn't we be that resource of help? What other kinds of things do you think might help the church grow?
I think the first thing that I think of, we gotta think differently. So the proactive is probably there, I mean, the list of things, but what
do you mean by thinking differently?
not just, so I know we're trying to specify, outwardly, but at my experience with the church as a whole, wherever we have been, is we are just gonna do what we've seen or what has been there. I mean, some of the things we've talked about are different. But I think we need to not pigeonhole ourselves into only doing what might have worked somewhere else, or we maybe just get rid of the fear.
I wrote down up here, you need a growth mindset.
There you go.
Carol Dweck wrote a book several years ago called Growth Mindset.
Right.
I mean, I think it's just called Mindset. But anyway, the book has to do with this idea of how that there are two types of mindsets that you can have. You can have a growth mindset or you can have a fixed mindset. A fixed mindset is the mindset that says we don't ever do anything different than the way we've always done it. We don't make changes, none of that kind of stuff. But a growth mindset is dynamic. I mean, it's not stagnant. I mean, it's something that's constantly moving, realizing that we've got to do some things differently in order to reach people where they are, in order to help them come to where they need to be, to help them come to know Jesus. And I would encourage you to get that book. I have some material that I have done from that book, but it's really a powerful way of realizing that we have got to think differently. We've got to think more from the standpoint of growth, which is what being proactive is all about. I mean, you have to think differently to be proactive. Now, again, we're not talking about making unbiblical or unscriptural changes. That's not what we're talking about. But doing these kinds of things, that's going to bring some change. You got to do some things differently. And you're going to have to think differently. You got to realize that, okay, this is not a bait and switch.
Right.
You know, that's one of the biggest challenges that I've seen with congregations is this concept of a bait and switch mindset. You know, we're going to offer this, but really we're just trying to get them in the building so that we are going to teach them. And that's not the way you do this. You do this because you want to get to know people.
Right.
And you want people to know you're here. When they come back, if they come on a Sunday, that's your invitation to say, we need to talk to you about Jesus. But this is done not to say, hey, we got you here, now let's tell you about Jesus. They won't come back ever if you do that. So you got to realize that the purpose of this is really just to meet people, get them to see the congregation, and do those kinds of things. I love the fact that this spins around. So, you got your Bibles, open up to the book of Nehemiah. What time is class in? Might be a good question.
9:15.
Okay.
Or sorry, 10:15.
Yeah. Okay, good. In the book of Nehemiah, you know, you might not think that the book of Nehemiah is a book where you're going, hey, this is a book on church growth. But there are some principles here in the book of Nehemiah that I think are incredibly good when we think about this idea of how to grow. And when you look at the book of Nehemiah, I use this acronym, GROW. Each letter here in the word grow is going to represent something that we find in the book of Nehemiah that I think is going to be incredibly important when we think about how to grow the church. Because you guys have some ideas now about being proactive, about prayer and thinking differently. So you've got some ideas about, okay, if we do some of these kinds of things, it's going to connect us to people in this community so that we can grow. And the very first step here in the book of Nehemiah is that if we're going to grow as a church, we're going to have to be God-centered. When you look at Nehemiah, this is such an incredible thing about Nehemiah. In chapter 1, Hanani, his brother, and some men from Jerusalem have come, and Nehemiah is inquiring as to the state of the situation in Jerusalem. And what happens is, they report to him that the walls have been torn down, the gates have been burned, and the people are in great reproach. Now, I want you to notice what happens when Nehemiah hears this situation. It says that he sat down and he wept and he mourned for days. He fasted and he prayed to the God of heaven. Now, in this text, we have his prayer. His prayer is identified here. And what's interesting about his prayer is that he acknowledges the greatness of God, and he also reminds God of the promise that God had made. But then you have this great section about his confession of sin. The confession not only of the sin of the nation of Israel, but of his own family and himself. And then he concludes by bringing this incredibly interesting request about granting favor in the eyes of this man, whom we assume in chapter 2 is going to be the king. Now, what's interesting about all of this is how God-centered Nehemiah was. You know, I talked a little bit yesterday morning, and some of you will remember this, the men who were here. I talked yesterday morning about the situation of leadership within the church and kind of the state of the church and the fact that there are so many congregations that are closing their doors. I mean, they're selling their buildings and there's nobody left. They've aged out. I mean, to the tune in the last 8 years of probably close to about 850 to 900 congregations across this country that no longer exist. And then when you couple that with the fact, as I mentioned yesterday, that 65% or about that of congregations in this country have no elders. And of the remaining approximately 35%, half of them only have 2. I mean, we're dealing with some very difficult situations when we think about the church. Well, my question is, when's the last time that we sat down and wept and mourned for days? When was the last time that we fasted and prayed to the God of heaven about the situation? Now, you can't read the book of Nehemiah without realizing the focus of Nehemiah on prayer. In fact, everything that you see taking place throughout this book continually talks about him praying. You have his prayer here in chapter 1, and then when you get into chapter 2, the king is going to ask him a question, what would you request? And he says, I pray to the God of heaven. And then you're going to continue to see this continual prayer of Nehemiah throughout chapter 4 and chapter 5 and chapter 6. I mean, he's going to continually be at the throne of God praying. He was God-centered. And if we're going to grow today, we're going to have to be the same. One of the biggest challenges I think facing the church today is we've got too many people that are more self-centered than they are God-centered. They're more concerned about themselves. They're more concerned about getting their own way. They're more concerned about making sure they have what they want than they are about focused on what God wants. And if the church is going to grow, it's never going to grow because of being self-centered. It's going to grow because we're God-centered. Every decision we make needs to be brought to the throne of God before we make it. You know, I have a class that I teach at Sunset, and one of the assignments that the students have to do is they have to watch this video clip with Richard Blackaby. Richard Blackaby is, I don't know if he's the president, CEO of the Gideon Bible Association. You know, the people that put the Bibles in all the hotel rooms. In this interview, the thing that he said that I thought was very interesting was he talked about this idea of how we tend to set goals and then we pray to God to bless those goals. He said, what would it be like if what we did first is if we prayed and asked God to help us see the goals He wants us to accomplish? Wouldn't it be better to know that God is guiding us in the direction of what we need to be doing rather than just saying, this is what we want to do, now God bless that? You know, you mentioned prayer, the foundational piece, and I think Nehemiah highlights that for us. That's what being God-centered is all about. You pray to God first, and then you start working. and watch God bless it. Now, the R, the R stands for relentless leadership. If we're going to grow the church, we're going to have leaders who are relentless. You know, when I read the book of Nehemiah, the thing I love about Nehemiah is that when he started, I mean in chapter 2, when he gets everybody fired up and ready to start rebuilding the wall. Now what happens is you've got Sanballat and Tobiah, who are really external guys that are not happy with the rebuilding of the wall. They don't want the Jews to come back. They're in opposition. And so what we find after we get into chapter 4 and following is that these guys and some others are going to start trying to create, a distraction. They're trying to distract the people from the work that they are doing. And Nehemiah as their leader. In fact, the first time they tried to get Nehemiah to come out and meet them, but he's like, I knew they were planning to cause me harm, so I'm like, I'm not going to leave. But he tells them, why would I leave this good work and come out to you? He's going to stay. He was relentless when it came to leading the people to do the work. He wasn't going to get distracted. But the biggest piece was he was not going to be discouraged. I mean, when you look through and you start reading about all the things that Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem are all going to say about Nehemiah and the work the Jews are trying to do, he says, what are these feeble Jews trying to do? He said, why, if a fox were to jump on that wall, it would bring it down. I mean, they're just trying to discourage the people who are doing the work and to discourage Nehemiah as their leader. But Nehemiah wasn't having it. I mean, he not only was not going to be distracted, he was not going to be discouraged, and he kept the people from being discouraged. Now, in the church today, we struggle with these two things. We easily get distracted. We get caught up in the minutia of things, and we just detail things. You know, it's that old idea of paralysis by analysis. You know, we don't make a decision because we need to get more information. And I've just seen it over and over. I worked with a congregation, actually preached for this congregation in Arkansas. They had a guy that came in. He was the manager of Cracker Barrel. Now, you talk about some nice perks. You have a member of the church who's a manager of Cracker Barrel. We ate there a lot. I liked it. He was a super neat guy, but he's a go-getter. You don't manage Cracker Barrel unless you know how to lead people. Well, he saw the need for the church there to have a van for our youth group and to be able to pick up our elderly in the winter when it was dark and they didn't drive at night. And he said, if we could get this van. So what he did was he went and did all the research for the elders. He had a folder that he showed them a picture of the van. It was a low mileage van. The price was right. I mean, he did all the stuff for them. He came in and said, we need this, and here's one option for you to get that. They said, well, let's think about it. Now, we had two elders. Month went by. Joe came to me and said, have they made a decision? I'm like, Joe, be patient. They can be slow sometimes. 2 months went by. 3 months went by. 4 months went by. In the 5th month, Joe took his family and they went to another congregation. We had money. It had nothing to do with the money. Paralysis by analysis. In the 6th month, they bought the van. I'm like, God help us. I mean, we lost a family that had 4 kids, teenagers, in our youth group because they couldn't make a decision. We need relentless leadership when it comes to church. We need men who can make a decision and let's move forward. It may be the wrong decision. I don't know. You don't know sometimes until you get started. If it's the wrong decision, you say, hey, we made a mistake. Let's back it up. Let's fix it and move forward. But to not make a decision is stagnating the church. We have got to grow, and it's going to take relentless leaders who are not distracted in the paralysis of analysis. But the other thing is that Satan is going to do everything in his power to discourage us. How he does it, I don't know. Everybody gets discouraged differently. Sometimes it's because we have expectations that we think people ought to know better or that they ought to do better, and then when they don't, we get discouraged. Anytime we put our confidence in people, we will always get discouraged because people are going to let us down. But that's not what leadership does. Relentless leaders aren't going to get discouraged, and they're not going to let their people get discouraged. Because where we place our confidence, where we place our trust and our faith is in God. That's why we have to be God-centered. Because when we are God-centered, then relentless leadership will not allow people to get distracted, nor to allow them to become discouraged. The letter O in the word grow stands for opportunity. Opportunity. This is one of my favorite things about the book of Nehemiah. You know, I find it interesting that when you read the chapter 1 in the book of Nehemiah, you have this situation that exists, you have them mourning and fasting and praying, and you have this prayer, and then after the prayer, there's this one sentence at the end of the chapter that to me I'm like, why? I don't know why translators, when they did chapters and verses, I don't know why they put that there like it's by itself. Because it just simply says, and I was cupbearer to the king. I'm like, okay, so what does that have to do with the price of eggs? You know, I was cupbearer to the king. Well, when you get into chapter 2, you find out the significance of that, which is why I'm not sure why they didn't put it in chapter 2. But in chapter 2, what happens is you find that Nehemiah is serving the wine to the king, and the king notices that Nehemiah is sad. He's like, you're sick, but this is not a sickness. You got a sadness of heart. He's wanting to know what's going on. And Nehemiah was a little bit afraid at first. And then he says, why would I not be sad when the city of the tombs of my fathers lies desolate? And the king says, what would you request? Now, you know what an opportunity is? An opportunity, by definition, is circumstances that present a possibility, either to be gained or lost. That's it. It's a circumstance or a situation that presents a possibility either to be gained or lost. Now, Nehemiah could see the possibilities here, and he was able to take advantage of the opportunity because when the king said, what would you request? First thing he does is he prayed to the God of heaven. And then he laid it out. He said, I need a letter from the king granting me safe passage to the governors of the provinces on the way to Jerusalem. And while I'm at it, he said, I need a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to get timber so that I can rebuild the gates of the city when I get there. Now, obviously, the king granted his request, and he's going to go. And then he has the task of being able to gather and assemble the people together and to challenge them with the task of fulfilling this vision of restoring God's people to the nation that they needed to be. But in order to do that, they were going to have to carry out the mission of rebuilding that wall. And here's what's interesting about what Nehemiah does. He gathers these people together and he says, you see the situation that exists. The wall's been torn down, the gates have been burned, so let us arise and build so that we will no longer be a reproach. And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and I gave them the words of the king. And the people said, so let us arise and build, and they put their hand to the good work. Here's what I find interesting about this text. Nehemiah said, if you see the situation that exists, you see how bad it is. Walls have been torn down, gates have been burned. And nobody said a word. They all knew the situation, but nobody said, let's get up and build. He even told them what they needed to do. He gave them a solution. Let us arise and build. Nobody budged. Nobody said a word. He even told them why they needed to do it, so that we'll no longer be a reproach. It was not until he gave them hope. When he said, I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and I told them the words of the king, then the text says, the people said, let us arise and build, and they put their hand to the good work. I'm convinced it's no different today. A lot of times we miss out on opportunities that exist because we think about the problem, we even know a solution, and we even know why we should do it. But the problem is we don't have hope. And if we're going to grow, we're going to have to take advantage of opportunities, but those opportunities won't happen unless we understand the hope that is here. We need to understand how the hand of our God has been favorable to us. I don't know what opportunities you're going to have, but I can tell you this. If you can't see the possibilities, you'll never take advantage of the opportunities. Let me just share with you the possibilities that exist. Here they are. And this is just scratching the surface. The possibilities are there. Now it's up to you to take advantage of the opportunities. But where that begins is being found. It's coming before the throne of God and praying and asking the God of heaven to help. You may have to acknowledge, hey, we've sinned. We haven't done anything for years, and it's time to fix that. It's time to get up and start doing something. That's why we need relentless leadership that will not be distracted and will not allow people to be discouraged. Because I'll tell you, there are going to be some valleys you have to walk through. There may be some criticism you have to endure. There may be some challenges that I don't even know of that may pop up, but you got to be willing to deal with that stuff and not get discouraged. And don't let it distract you from the task that's at hand. Because when you can see the possibilities, God will make the opportunities available. And when those opportunities come, you've got to be willing to arise and put your hand to the good work. The letter W in this word grow you have to work together. This is not a one-man show. It's not a one-woman show. It's not a couple of people show. This is an entire body show. Everybody has to work together if we're going to grow the church. You know, there's a chapter here in the book of Nehemiah. It's the most underread chapter in this entire book. I get so tickled. I mean, we love the narrative of Nehemiah. We love that first chapter about the prayer and his fasting and praying to the God of heaven. We like chapter 2 because he goes out and investigates the situation, and he comes back and he starts getting the people together and casts this vision for them and challenges them to the work, and they get excited. Then there's some opposition. Then we get to chapter 3, and chapter 3 is that chapter where we start reading about all of these individuals who were involved in doing the work, and so we just kind of skip over that because we can't pronounce the names most of the time. So we go to chapter 4 because chapter 4 gets us right back on the narrative. And we like that narrative because chapter 4 is that big scene, you know, where they're out here they're putting stone down with one hand and they're holding a weapon in the other. I mean, they're ready to fight at moment's notice. If the bugle sounds, then everybody's to rally together and they're going to fight against the enemy. And we just continue to read that narrative, and we love that. But chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the most awesome chapter in this book. And I'll tell you, this is the coolest chapter because when you read this chapter, what you're going to find is there's not one person in this chapter that is identified as being a stonemason. Isn't that interesting? I mean, you would think if you're rebuilding a block rock wall that you'd want somebody who was a stonemason, wouldn't you? But there's not one person in that chapter that's identified as a stonemason. What you find is just the opposite. You find fathers who are working with their daughters. You find merchants and jewelers and perfumers. You have all these different people from all these different trades that are all coming together to do this work. Starting with the leaders, the high priest in verse 1 and their brothers. They started it. That's where it begins. It always begins with leadership, and then it works its way down. Because if the leaders aren't doing it, why would anybody else? Starts with leadership, relentless leadership, and then we work our way down. You have everybody, every walk of life, their families, everybody's involved in doing the work. But here's the coolest part about this chapter. When I read this chapter, it's 32 verses long. And in the first half, in the first 15 verses of this chapter, first 15, 16, you have this phrase that's used over and over and over again. But then in verse 16, the phrase changes. And in the last half of the chapter, it's a different phrase that's used over and over and over. In the first half of the book, or first half of the chapter, the phrase is, and next to. And next to this guy, these people work. And next to them, this guy worked. And next to him, these people work. And next to them, and next to him, and next to them, and next to, it's just over and over and over. And next to this person was this person. But in verse 16, everything changes. In the last half of the chapter, the phrase is, and after him. And after him, these people worked. And after them, this person worked. And after him, and after them, and after him. And it's just over and over and over. Now, this is just the way my mind works. I'm kind of like, why did he make this change? I mean, why, as you're talking about the rebuilding of the wall, do you have this emphasis upon next to this person, but then halfway through the chapter, you've got, and after them. And here's what I came to the conclusion of. When you look at the first half of this chapter, what you find is you have people working side by side in the trenches. From the leadership all the way down. They are standing side by side next to this person's working. And next to this one, you've got this family working. And they are all in the trenches working together, side by side. And then I realized people can only work so high. I mean, you can only go so high. And then you've got to have someone who comes along after you that can continue to build. Does that make sense? That's what's happening here. Now, the church here in Albert Lea, when did it first start? Does anybody know the date that this congregation had its beginning in this community?
We know the year, 1972.
When? 72?
Yep.
71, 72, okay, so somewhat a little over 50 years ago. And I'm confident, based on some of the conversation we had last night, that everybody in this room, we're standing on the shoulders of some pretty great men and women who had the kind of faith that said, hey, we need to start a congregation of Lord's Church here in Albert Lea. But you know, there's a thing about life that is limited by what we call death. And people can only build so high, and then they cross the finish line into eternity. And here we are, we've come along after them. And we are building this wall in Albert Lea. And every single one of us in this room can only build so high because we're going to, at some point in life, face that threshold in which we cross into eternity. And someone is going to have to come along after us and continue this work. The question you have to ask yourself is this: what kind of church are you going to lead them? I can't answer that. Only you can. But I can tell you this. If you want this to be a growing and thriving church, you're going to need to be God-centered at the core foundation. You're going to have relentless leaders who are not distracted and not discouraged by the challenges that come as a leader. And you're going to have to take advantage of the opportunities, but in order to do that, you're going to have to see the possibilities, as we just mentioned, on the other side of this Bible. If you get nothing else out of it, I hope that what you get is this. If you're going to grow, you're going to have to work together. You're going to have to work together. There's not one person in this room that is unimportant when it comes to growing God's people. Not one. Every person in this room plays a part. Not everybody's going to do the same part. The church wasn't designed that way. I mean, read Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12. I mean, the church was never designed that everybody do the same thing. But if everybody does something, and we work together, then what we're going to see is growth. We're going to grow individually. We're going to grow as a body. God will be glorified. The kingdom will be enlarged. And the future of this church will be secure. So when you think about how do we grow the church, I hope that you'll think about these things and that you'll think about these things. And again, it's just a start. It's just a start. But if you'll do it, you'll be surprised what this place will look like in just a few years. It won't be the same because of this one. Oh, there's so much more I could say, but it's about 10:22. So probably I'll wrap this up here so that we can get started on some other things. But I appreciate your attention, especially appreciate the information here. I think this is good for you guys to work with. I'm going to leave that up there so you can take a picture of it before from that. But
if anybody's got something you thought of that we didn't write down, come write it down.
yeah, yes.
I'll take a picture too.
Yeah, write it down up there. But I am just so thankful to get to be part of this, and I look forward to being able to come back in the future and continue to do work with you and other things, and just seeing this really blossom. Because that's what we want to do with the Sunset program at SALT. We want to walk alongside you. We want to help. We want to do the things that we can do to help this congregation really become what you want it to be. And we will do what we can to help you get there. During the worship hour, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. So I'm kind of excited about that, but I'll explain more of that here in just a few minutes.